Canada's military ombudsman, Pierre Daigle, paints a picture of a troubled life for military families and returning soldiers. And joining us now for more on his new report and the level of care they're receiving in our nation's capital, Pierre Daigle. He is the ombudsman for the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Forces, and the author of the new report, which is called On the Homefront, Assessing the Well-Being of Canada's Military Families in the New Millennium. And Monsieur Daigle, we're happy to have you on TVO tonight. How are you doing?
I'm very fine. Thank you very much for having me, Steve.
Not at all. I know that the numbers in the United States look like this. About 20 to 30% of American soldiers have returned from Iraq and Afghanistan with sustained psychological injuries. And I wonder if the numbers in Canada are comparable. What's your knowledge on this?
You know, I don't have the exact number of people suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. This was in our, when we published our report on operational stress injury last September 2012, this was one concern that we have, is that the Canadian Forces could not give us exact numbers, a database of how many people are suffering from those ailments.
Why not?
Well, you know, we have tons of number, but not one number. They don't have the information technology to provide those statistics. They received not really updated data or statistics from their 26 mental health clinics across the country. They have a system right now which is called the Canadian Forces Health Information System, but which was not really built in to provide this kind of information. And this is a sad thing, because if you don't know the scope of the problem, it's very difficult to calibrate, the priority and resources effectively.
Absolutely, but okay, we don't have a specific number. Do you have a good sense of where things are at for Canadian Forces post-Afghanistan?
Well, definitely since we've started working on the report on post-traumatic stress disorder, we've done about, in our office, I would say, including the one in 2002 from André Marin, we've done 5 reports with about 50 recommendations. So there was improvement onto the care provided to the people suffering from operational stress injury over 10 years. For instance, the Canadian Forces, there was an evolution from an ad hoc system into a more structured delivery system for people who are suffering. There's more leadership commitment now in the Canadian Forces to, I would say, institutionalize the reality of post-traumatic stress disorder. But there are still other issues that needs to be done better.
Well, let's get into that, because part of that Marin report back in 2002 suggested the number of mental health care providers that were needed within the Canadian Forces was pegged at 447. So let's find out, more than a decade later, where we are today. Are we near that number?
Not yet. You know, Steve, in 2002, the Canadian Forces Health System and Canada Health Survey, they pegged the requirement at 447, as you mentioned. But that was done before the Afghanistan war. So in 2005 till 2009, the Canadian Forces endeavored to increase the then 229 provider to reach this 447. But they've never reached that level. Since 2010, it has flatlined at 380. So what we would say is there's about 15 to 22% of shortage in the number of care provided required.
And how would you characterize the shortfall that we're currently suffering from?
Well, 15 to 22% in chronic undermanning for taking care of people who are injured, I would say this is likely, the requirement is likely to be higher. This, as I said, was identified before the Afghanistan war, and for this past 10 years, the number of people suffering from post-traumatic stress injury is increasing, and we're a bit afraid that because of the deceleration post-Afghanistan, that maybe they will, what we say, take the foot off the gas. But I think that we need to be prepared for an increase because of this latency of post-operation, and also the cumulative effect of those 20 years of very intense operation.
But let's really understand what this means in terms of services, not being offered to people who need them. How does this affect the troops who are returning and who need those services?
Well, as I said, the overall structure to provide care to the ill and injured has improved very much since 2002. There's a greater geographic footprint across the country. There's about 26 clinics. There are mental health services within important major deployable elements and so on. But the fact of the matter is that the care provider right now, who are in limited number, they're the one who make the system work. They're the one that their professionalism and dedication make it work. But we're facing more and more some of those care providers suffering also burnout because they're overburdened by the work. So far service is given to those people who are injured, but at one point it becomes a bit stretched.
Well, that's actually, I was going to follow up with that. How concerned are you that, in fact, because of the shortfall, there is a significant burnout potential in the people who actually are doing the work today?
Well, I'm very concerned because, as I said, if we figure that, if the system figured that they would need 447 people to take care, that was 10, 11 years ago, and now we know that they haven't taken into account the Afghanistan era, so we suspect there are going to be more requirements to take care of people, and if you don't, and you have still difficulty to fill the vacant position, and the people in place are themselves becoming burnout, at the end of the day, it will be critical that people might not have enough care and support within the system. So what they will start doing, like some are doing now, is to contract out the services. So our members will go outside the Canadian Forces to get some specialized treatment. And then at the end of the day, this is another problem in itself.
Let me next read an excerpt from the André Marin report from 2002, which said the following. It found overwhelming evidence that many within the Canadian Forces are skeptical about whether PTSD is a legitimate illness. There was a distressingly common belief among both peers and leaders that those diagnosed with PTSD were fakers, malingerers, or simply poor soldiers. We found that members with PTSD are often stigmatized, ostracized, and shunned by their peers and the chain of command. And I wonder, more than a decade later now, Monsieur Daigle, the stigma of mental injury within the armed forces, is this still a significant obstacle in your view?
When we did our follow-up report in 2012, we did find out that since 2002 and 2008, the peer and supervisor stigma that we're talking about has reduced. It's still there, but it has reduced very much. There was a lot of sensitization to people about it and so on. What we found out is that the self-stigma is still there. Self-stigma, in our view, is probably unlikely that it will ever completely disappear. But there was improvement, and this was considered in 2002 and 2008 a barrier for members to receive services. But I would say that the stigma has been reduced. But I'm concerned also about this self-stigma, that people don't want to come forward and to admit that maybe they are suffering.
Well, they don't want to come forward because they're afraid it will hurt their career. So the question I have for you is, will it hurt their career?
Well, it is very legitimate that they're afraid to hear that it will hurt their career. At the end of the day, it might bring an end to their career. People who are suffering don't come forward sometimes. Some of them just cannot reconcile being a warrior with succumbing to an injury of the mind. So they say it happens to the other but not me, or they'll try to take care of themselves by themselves. But they are very much concerned that if they come forward, that they will lose their career. And at the end of the day, if they come forward, they will receive the care. And it could be, and we have some data, but I don't remember exactly, of people returning back to their unit that been taken care of. But also, There are people who just aren't back in good health enough to continue within the military, and then they are released from the Canadian Forces.
I'd like to read one more comment to you here, this one from John Whalen, who's a veteran and a psychologist, and he said this about those who are medically released due to mental injury. He said they go through this transition of their career being over, and then when they're referred to me, they're in a full mental health crisis again. What goes with this transition out of the military is this complete loss of confidence in an identity that they spent many years developing, and all of a sudden that's gone. So my biggest concern is that when they leave the military, they are isolated. This successful transition from the military life to the civilian life, is this an area of concern for your office?
It is definitely a concern because let's think about it. You know, a lot of people, when they join the Canadian Forces, they join the forces in their early adulthood. So when we say they're returning to civilian life, this is a very complex and doesn't exactly mean what people might think it means. For some of them, there was no professional civilian life before the Canadian Forces. So they're serving their country, service before self. They expect obviously their country to take care of them if they're injured in the service of their country. Then in the past, many years ago, it was probably easier to take care of some of the injured people because there were not that many. The intensity of operation was not as high. But you know, more and more with the more operational tempo, with the greater people being sick, with the more systemic approach of the Canadian Forces and implementation of the universality of service, that you're a soldier first, well, some of them find themselves leaving the forces. And what we find among those people is they have a sense of betrayal. You know, they said, you know, there was a sacred contract, moral contract. I've served my country, I'm injured, and now you just kick me in the street. So when what you're saying, people say they feel isolated, I would agree to that. Because, you know, if they leave the forces, it's because they're not in a good health enough to continue to serve. Therefore, they're still, you know, sick. And then they find themselves in an unknown environment, civilian street, while they're sick. So I agree. They must feel very isolated and you know, abandoned by people.
Of all of the recommendations that you just released in your most recent report a couple of days ago, what's the one thing you would most like to see implemented as fast as possible?
The report we just released has to do with the effect of military life on family, right?
Yes.
That's the one you're talking about?
Exactly.
What we said in that report, Steve, is that the frequent relocation and the operational deployment have an effect on military family. It has an effect on spousal employment, on accessibility to health care, on housing, but particularly also on children. And I'm very concerned about that. Because if we want to make a link between this and the post-traumatic stress disorder and so on, we know that since there are some Canadian Forces members who don't come forward, so their only care provider, it's their spouse at home, because they cannot take advantage of the services from the Canadian Forces because they don't want to use that. They don't want to tell people they're sick, and people sick at home. So we need to help the spouse. That will help their other husband or spouse who are sick. And we find out that the deployment, and particularly when people coming back injured, it has a dramatic effect on children. It has, we see behavioral, emotional, disciplinary problems with children. We see academic performance being affected as well. There's a study that shows that it has a negative effect on their health, increased stress, and sleeping disorder. So the constant deployment, and particularly with people who are sick and who do not go forward to get some help, obviously everything is dealt with within the confine of a family. And you know, if I may, Steve, we haven't analyzed that too deeply, but more and more we see that it might be the cause of broken marriage or divorce, because it's not that the spouse, let's say the wife, that really wants a divorce, but at the end of the day, They want to give their children and their family a stable and healthy environment, and to deal with a sick person in the house is at one point too much. And so this is a very delicate and very sensitive and definitely critical effect on families.
Understood. Ombudsman Pierre Daigle, thank you so much for coming on TVO tonight. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for your interest.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.